Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to COVID, well-being, business continuity, resilience, disaster planning, anything that's relatable to those topics, and anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I respond to everything I get. And a quick reminder, I will be speaking at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference, November 30th to December 2nd, actually, sorry. It's now virtual, and it's gone to 3 days. But I'm also going to be a part of the media desk, co-hosting it with a colleague of the Epic podcast, Grayson Crockett. So he and I will be manning that desk. We'll see how that goes, and if I step on his feet, or how I can take over things sometimes. But I'm looking forward to that and working with Grayson. That'll be a lot of fun, I'm sure. As you can tell, it is that time again. It's time for Regina Phelps and our November 2021 update on all things related to COVID. Regina, welcome back.
Alex, it's always so good to see you. And yes, indeed, here we are. It's the day of the week, a day of the month with Regina at Alex's place.
Did you know this is the 21st episode?
Is it really? Oh my gosh.
Of us talk just on COVID.
I was going to say, we've talked about lots of other things, but yeah. Well, and as we will talk about very shortly, and sadly, we always have so much to talk about.
We do. So let's jump in, because I know we've got a whole bunch of things to talk to today. Where are we now?
Oh my gosh.
Would you like me to go first with Canada
Yeah, go first with Canada.
Okay.
And I'm really sad that you guys are not doing as well as you were.
Well, actually, some areas here, new cases are up 14% over rolling 7 days. Deaths are down 2%. We're still over 29,300 plus. Hospitalizations are down 9% overall, and now that's nationwide. And for vaccinations, we have over 78% now have at least the first dose, and over 75% are fully vaccinated. So we've got some good numbers there.
That's great.
However, we do have a couple of spots that are still struggling a little bit. A couple of the western provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta, and Ontario. In the last few days, we have spiked up. We went from high 200s, low 300s to 550, 600, and yesterday, talk about an ominous number, 666.
I can't tell you how many Canadian friends of mine sent me that saying, "Ooh, what does this specific number mean?"
I heard the number in the car yesterday, and I actually said out loud, "Wow, that's ominous." Just that number.
Well, we have to make some jokes out of this, because after all, what else, right?
So it's gone up, but a couple of things, and I kind of alluded to it before we started recording, is just over a month ago was our Thanksgiving, which is exactly what happened last year. After our Thanksgiving, we started to have a spike. It's been a couple of weeks now since people could go back and forth across the border, and now the border is fully open, air and land. So that's changed, because we were starting to accept people into Canada, but Canadians weren't allowed to go down into the US yet until last weekend, I believe it was. So that's changed now, and we've got a lot more international travel happening in the last 3 weeks. Well, as you know, 3-4 weeks, you start seeing, changes, and that's exactly where we are now. And in Ontario, I'm sure everybody's heard of Toronto. Toronto is the capital of Ontario, not Canada, like they might want to think they are, but they're, a huge international airport, and Montreal as well, a huge international airport in Quebec. And you can see in those areas now spikes. So that's kind of telling. A couple of other quick updates. Vaccines were approved for children 5 to I think it was 11.
5 to 11, right.
5 to 11
here
now.
in the States.
So that's been approved. Moderna booster shots have been approved. Unvaccinated federal employees that weren't granted exemptions are now put on unpaid leave as of
Wow.
today. So
Wow.
I'm sure some of those people are now going to turn around and maybe start finally getting vaccinated.
And what's the percentage of that? Is there any report about how many of those employees are unvaccinated?
I read the article and there wasn't actually a percentage. They just said it's a high percentage of employees. So I don't really have a number, but I've been hearing that it's well over 85 to 90%. So it is a rather high number of people that have got their shots. So it's only about 10% at the most of people that don't have their shots. Continuing on with that, in Ontario, long-term care workers have to have their first shot also within the next week, or they're going to be losing their jobs and put on unpaid leave. But they already have a success of over 95% of staff that have received their double shots. Wow. So, which
you guys are really kicking it in Canada. You're just beating us.
Sometimes.
Well, in this case, you really are.
I don't really understand how medical staff and long-term care workers, etc., won't get their shots or can't get their shots, because by not getting it, you're actually putting the people you're hired to care for in danger, which doesn't make logical sense to me on that.
And they should have. You would think they would understand the science more, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's my big update, because I know there's so much more happening in the US and around the world, especially one particular spot.
Yes. Well. So thank you for that pitch to me. So let me just talk about the world, and then I'll talk about the US. So as I'm sure you've been seeing, there is really a lot of action happening in cases. And let me just say that I understand that looking simply at case numbers is not reflective of really the true pandemic, because people can be reinfected, people can have modest infections, et cetera. And the usual indicator is really cases and is deaths and hospitalizations. But in many places in the world, that number is often hard to really see or be able to obtain easily. So it's still easier to get a sense of what's happening by looking at cases. My goodness, isn't some places that are surprising on fire? Germany in particular, in the European Union, has got their biggest cases yet. And the Netherlands and Denmark and Sweden. Oh yeah, and then there's Russia and all of Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. I mean, all of those places are on fire. And not only are they reporting large number of cases, they're reporting significant critical issues in hospitals with the lack or no ICU beds, in limited staffing. It's really surprising, and well, not so much for the Eastern Europeans and Russia, because they've had a really awful uptake of vaccines. I mean, Russia, which invented the Sputnik 5, which actually turned out to be a good vaccine, is not trusted at all by Russians, and only about 33% of Russians are vaccinated. So there's a zillion people to infect in that country. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's also Turkey, and then dropping down. I also saw that Vietnam had a big spike. So there's a lot going on globally. But yet China is still pursuing a COVID-0 strategy, the only country left in the world to do so. They just last week sent out a sort of news notice to all citizens of China that everyone should have at least probably 2 weeks of food in their homes, because they should be expected to have a snap lockdown at any time. Over half of the provinces in China are reporting the highest case counts of COVID-19 since the pandemic began in the late fall in China. So there's I'm kind of curious as to how long they'll be able to do this, but of course, with their style of government and their really, hard-fisted authoritarian reign, they can pull it off. But, at some point, it's going to move around that country regardless of their intent.
Well, they did that once before, right? Shut the whole country down for a couple of weeks, way back in March or whatever it was last year.
Right, right. Yeah, so I think that will be interesting to see as it plays out over time. So the world is, kind of a mixed bag, but places like Africa, the continent itself, is really quiet. South America, really quiet. So what does that mean? Who knows? I mean, we could speculate, well, gosh, maybe they've had so much infection there because they don't have much vaccine, especially in Africa, that it can't be the fact that there's so much immunity everywhere. But then some people say, well, yeah, there probably is. But they said that about other countries that turned out not to be the case. So I think it's probably stay tuned. And I would think you could expect the Southern Hemisphere at some point is going to light up.
Well, if memory serves correct, South America kind of was rolling after us. When we
Yes.
had our big spike, they were down. When we were coming down, they were going up.
Right.
As
Right.
we're kind of going up right now, they're down.
Right.
So I think you're right. Give it
A month or two, right?
weeks or months.
Right.
That will change and they will start going up. But did you hear? I think it was Austria. If you're unvaccinated, you have to go into lockdown. They're not allowed.
Oh, I didn't see that.
I hope I'm remembering that correctly, and someone can send me an email if I am. But I heard it on the radio. If you're unvaccinated, you're on lockdown.
Wow.
You can't go anywhere. The only place you can go is to a doctor's office to get a needle.
Wow.
So that I thought that was wow. That's really heavy-handed. But because that's almost the China approach. Have your food.
Yeah, and kind of surprising for Austria in my mind. But
yeah, it is.
I think some countries are really feeling desperate, if you will. And certainly you're seeing like in Eastern Europe, and I don't want to use the word desperate for Germany, but I think when they really begin to see the significant impact in their healthcare system, that's when a lot of countries really start to get serious. And, many countries, I mean, not everybody has tons of healthcare. I mean, in the United States, we don't have a zillion ICU beds everywhere. And when they start to become restricted, it really is a significant issue. So, yeah, I think you're going to see that continue to play out. So let me talk about.
I think a lot of governments and people too are getting fed up, not just fed up with COVID, but fed up with why can't we beat this?
Right.
Those of you that protest, those of you that won't get vaccinated, those of you that continue to spread lies or misinformation, we're fed up. We've had enough now.
Yeah.
Now it's time for the heavy hammer. If you're vaccinated, all these rules aren't going to impact you. So you're not worried about it. But if you're doing nothing and you're just spreading misinformation and causing the problem, well, we've had enough of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let me talk a little bit about the US because, as usual, we're kind of a mess as always. I don't know. I shouldn't be so negative about that, but so I'm going to just talk about, as we normally do, I'm going to just use a few slides back and forth as we talk over our time together today. So this is the question that everybody always asks me, are we done yet? We're in a usual pattern that really, I'll be honest with you, no epidemiologist or infectious disease physician can tell you why we do this. But just as you pointed out that we have this sort of flow back and forth between the Northern and Southern Hemisphere, we do the same thing in many parts of the world where someplace gets on fire for a couple of months, and then there's this huge dramatic drop, 2-3 months. Then we have this surge, and then all of a sudden it just drops. Does anybody know why it drops? The answer is no. You can guess, you can speculate, but no one actually really knows, Alex. And that's, there's still lots of people there to infect, but for some reason the virus sort of putters out. And so I think what we can think about as we go forward with both immunity from infection, but hopefully more vaccination, that will begin to be less and less. So our surges hopefully will become less and less. And everybody asks me about the winter, here in the United States. And, we are in a bad place for the winter. We're going to have a surge. The question is, how bad is it going to be? How impacted are the healthcare systems going to be? And what is it going to mean overall for all of us personally, our families, et cetera? And
you guys have your Thanksgiving holiday, your biggest holiday.
Oh yeah, baby.
In a week.
Yeah, right.
Just over a week, and that's triggered your last big spike last year.
Right. I mean, the holidays are coming, and just as you experienced last year in Canada, where you had a big bump after the Thanksgiving holiday in Canada. You can expect probably pretty much the same here. We're going to talk about that later on today. So our U.S. trends, my gosh, Alex, it's so heartbreaking. First of all, just sort of stop and look at the top left-hand box. We're already plateaued. I mean, these numbers right here are about 72,000. So we stopped at about 70,000 cases, and now we're going back up. And again, I understand that cases aren't always the clear indicator, but let me just say to you, that's a pretty lousy place to plateau at 70,000. As you can see from our history, that's the highest plateau we've had. So then if you look at hospitalizations, it's also sort of stopping its drop. It's about 48,000 people hospitalized in the US with COVID. There are still some states that have crisis standards of care still. Idaho's had 30 plus days of crisis standards of care, which means that's a certain level of rationing.
Wow.
Our tests are still pretty high, and you can see our deaths are now sort of stopped at about 1,200. So that's pretty significant. Sorry, my timer's going off there. I was trying to keep track of our time. And as always, we're going to be later than we thought, right? So here you can see in the US, we also have this pattern of where we flip, just as you were talking about, north to south, south to north, and then we go kind of east to west. So as you remember, Florida, Texas was a mess for months during the summer. Now it has gone north. It's even hitting places, frankly, like Maine and Connecticut and Vermont, who have a very high vaccination rate. And then as you go towards the west, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then dropping down to New Mexico and Arizona. So we've, this has been our pattern. We go north, south, east, west, 2 or 3 months. And then, like, as you can see now, Florida looks like they've been fine all along, which of course we know isn't the case. So it's a big issue. So I think maybe we should sort of stop there, and then I'll talk about what the future may hold for us. How's that?
That sounds like a good spot. We're talking this month with Regina Phelps, and we will be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Regina Phelps, all things COVID related. Regina, some great information in the first segment, and I don't know if anyone, well, I know people in Voice America will not be able to see this crystal ball picture you've got up on the video, but what do you see coming our way?
My crystal ball is always, I think anybody who's trying to prognosticate over the pandemic is always cloudy. But I think there's some certain trends that we can expect to see as we go forward. But what's going to be frankly determining our future, to be honest with you, Alex, are 2 things. One thing that we can control, and the second thing that we can't. The first thing is vaccinations. Vaccinations are the only way out of the pandemic. Let's just be frank here. So getting vaccinated is the most important thing that anyone can do that's listening to your program anywhere in the world to actually stop the pandemic. So it's all about vaccines, vaccines, vaccines. And if you're in a country that is doing any boosts, so for example, the United States, Canada, and a few other countries are doing boosters, that will help to fight waning immunity. Because there's really 2 things going on here. We've got people that are unvaccinated and have not been infected. Those folks are ripe for a coronavirus infection. And then secondarily, people who have had a vaccine and it's been over 6 months, studies have shown that vaccine is beginning to wane. And let me just talk about that just for a minute in particular, because that may make some people think, well, hey, the vaccine is not doing its job. It's only been 6 months. And there's been a huge amount of discussion about this in the infectious disease world. And one of the things I would say to you is that when the vaccines were first created, they did very specific trials based on 2 doses, so many days apart. Now, in many vaccine trials prior to this pandemic, they would have tried many combinations. They would have tried 1 dose and then maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months later getting another dose. They might have even tried a 3rd dose. That is really common. But when you're in the middle of a global pandemic that's killing a bunch of people, you don't have a lot of time. And so they just said, okay, great. This is our strategy. Moderna did 4 weeks between the vaccines. Pfizer did 3, and they had a 2-dose regimen. And as the results came back, of course, they were brilliant in the 90% range, which is wildly successful and very unusual, actually. So now that we are actually living with the vaccine, living with the pandemic, we're discovering that we have waning immunity. People should think like, that's actually is an okay thing. I mean, we're discovering this. This is science in real time. And usually it goes over for a long period of time. So very likely what's going to happen out of this is that over time, I could see that the first between dose 1 and 2 will be a longer period of time, because when they did that actually in the UK and in places in Canada, you have a better immunity on the second shot than those of us that just did the 3 or 4 weeks. That's the first thing. And then secondarily, it would not surprise me at all over time and study that this will be a 3-shot regimen. And so we'll know how we're doing about 6 months from now, when they can then study people who have had 2 doses plus a boost as to what our immunity is. So what I would say to any of your listeners, if you're in a country where they are giving boosters and you're eligible, and it's been over 6 months for either J&J, Pfizer, Moderna, get boosted. And it's really important. So that's critical. And the other thing is kids now, as you mentioned, 5 to 11 in Canada, but also in the United States with Pfizer, kids are not eligible to be vaccinated. And that's really important as the holidays are coming. So here for Thanksgiving in November, but also for Christmas, New Year in December, January. Currently, the studies are that a third of the parents in the US can't wait to get their kids vaccinated. A third are saying, I'm going to wait and see how it goes for those people to go first. And then a whole third, that's a lot of people, Alex, are saying they're not going to vaccinate their kids. So again, that means that we just have a larger reservoir of people for infection. So what will help the pandemic are vaccines, boosting kids with vaccines and jabs in the arm. What's going to potentially derail us will be the immersion of variants. We have been super fortunate that, thank God, the last big variant, which was awful, was Delta. But there's a lot of other things that could happen. There's one that's circulating now, but Delta is still beating it down. It's actually a subset of Delta that actually is more evasive of vaccines and monoclonal antibodies. But currently, right now, it's not getting much traction because Delta still is the big gorilla in the room. But that could really change everything for us as we go forward.
I'm just curious, because as you were talking about the kids and a third of the US population, and obviously there's percentages in other countries as well. If they're not going to get their vaccinations for COVID, and there's already delays, because of availability, because of appointments and what's open and things like that, delays in regular child vaccinations, are we running the risk now of seeing a reemergence of chickenpox or measles?
Oh, totally.
Or any of those other kind of?
Totally. And that's worldwide. That's actually, it's certainly an issue in like the US and Canada, but worldwide, it's even a greater problem where a lot of vaccines pretty much just stopped in their tracks. And so measles, chickenpox, mumps, all of those things that there are vaccines for, there is always a chance in all countries, but especially now that these things could begin to be more problematic. Absolutely.
That's what I thought, and
the other thing I think that,
go ahead.
The other thing I think I would just mention is that, so these two things really determine what our future is going to be. I don't know, but if we don't get good vaccine coverage, and we have the potential of a variant, we could still be in kind of an iffy situation. The other thing that we're going to have to contend with this year is the flu, because now that there are more people moving about, less people masked, more restaurants, I don't know about Canada, but everything in many parts of the United States is wide open. I live in a very health conscious and conservative, not politically, but conservative from the COVID perspective, in California and San Francisco in the Bay Area. And people are still masked, lots everywhere. But that's not the case in many parts of the United States. But the flu is going to be a big concern this year. And part of it is that there wasn't any circulating last year because everybody was masked and locked up. And so this year is going to be an unknown. I would encourage if your listeners are in the United States that they always go on a weekly basis to something called Flu Weekly, which is a monitoring site by the CDC. This is the map of last week. And as you can see, when you look at the map, here in the US, there's not much going up flu-wise, except New Mexico. Like, what's happening there? There's a lot of concern that there's going to be a lot more flu this year. And that's going to cause a lot of confusion because people are going to have symptoms and they're going to be saying to themselves, oh my gosh, do I have the flu? Do I have COVID? And so I think that's going to be a big concern as we go forward. Have you gotten your flu shot, Alex?
Not yet. I have an appointment with my doctor in a couple of weeks and for my annual physical, and I get my shot then.
That's great. Good.
Or I can just stop in the local grocery store, not grocery store, what am I saying? The local drugstore, because they're already advertising on the news. Come in, just walk in, and get your shot. Just come in and get your shot.
Right. And this is the time to do it. When you think about the timing for flu vaccinations, if you get it too early, so that would have been like October, then there's a possibility that the flu season might be more protracted and it kind of wanes out, kind of in March at that point. So November is a really prime time to get vaccinated for the flu. And again, there's not much going on right now. Last year, there was none, but we have this light up in New Mexico, which is also lit up from COVID too, interestingly enough. So that means that there's a potential that we could have a lot more of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone get your flu shot.
Yes. Yeah. What I'd like to talk about is this definition issue of endemics, pandemics, and epidemics. You're seeing all over the world a lot of discussion that, oh my gosh, has COVID become endemic? So I think it's really important that we understand what those words mean because they're actually being used incorrectly. I think when most people talk about COVID being endemic now, what they're really saying is that it's going to be with us the rest of our days. And that's true. It's never going away. The thing that was miraculous about SARS-CoV-1, the first coronavirus infection that, if you remember, 2003, of course, lit up Toronto.
Yep.
It disappeared off the face of the earth after about 18 months. Wow, weren't we lucky? But this is not going to happen with SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. But it's not endemic. And so let me explain the definitions between the two. First of all, there's no line in the sand that happens when you actually cross from a pandemic to an epidemic to an endemic. It's simply words. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It's not like we hit a bump going, oh, wow, we're into the next phase. No, it's not how it works. The definition, as we have been living and know very clearly now, a pandemic is a global infectious disease across wide parts of the world, many regions. And so it's affecting a large number of people, but it's all over the world. And we've been living that, of course, for the last 20 months. An epidemic is different because it's restricted in size and spread. So it can be a large number of people. It's in a population, but it has a short period of time. So the flu has the potential every year to be an epidemic. But an endemic, to sort of get into our definitions here, is something where it's maintained at a baseline, which means it's kind of always out there, but it's not overburdening healthcare systems. It's not changing behavior. So many times we can have an endemic flu. It's moving around, people are getting sick, but it's not killing a lot of people. It's not causing a lot of hospitalizations. So endemic means there's no real impact on healthcare. It's not really causing a lot of issues. And that is not where we are with COVID. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be there probably for another year or longer. Now, is it going to get more normal in places? Yes. I mean, here in the Bay Area, to be honest with you, in San Francisco, we could literally probably be living a much different life because we have a very high vaccination rate, very high compliance with issues regarding distancing and masking and all of that stuff, but still people are very conservative overall. And so our case numbers remain extremely low, and our behaviors are still very towards the fact that we're masked and distanced and all of that. So we are going to get here at some point, but not right away. So that's the key thing to talk
Do you
about.
think some people are saying endemic because pandemic scares people? Let's replace the word to try and minimize it.
I think what they're trying to use is that, again, it's completely out of context, but I think what they're trying to say is that we are in a transition. And there isn't really a word, I think, in the world of epidemiology that really makes sense based on where we are in most places of the world. Endemic is not where we are. Now, are we in a place where it's ripping out? For the most part, no. But then again, look at Russia, look at Turkey, look at Germany. I mean, there are some places that are on fire. Right now, if you look at places like San Francisco, not much transmission at all. So I think the problem is that people are trying. I think it's the crisis communications problem we've had in the entire pandemic. Alex, we've talked about that before. Is that there is not good messaging about what's happening, and I think a good discussion takes time. And I think in the sound bite world that we live in, there's not a way to describe everything I just said to you, in 30 seconds. And so I think people are looking for some sort of catch-all phrase that sort of indicates that we might be in some sort of transition, where in reality, we're not really yet.
Yeah.
And I think this really, the thing that I think that's really, really different is that this disease has a long tail. Now, what do I mean by that? There is so much impact that this pandemic has had. So even when it becomes where we have lower transmission, no real significant impact on healthcare, there are a zillion things that are still going to be reeling many countries. The first one is the post-acute sequela of SARS-CoV-2, which of course is long COVID. 10% of the people between 18 and 49 have symptoms of long COVID, and it's much higher for those over the age of 70, about 22%. And there is a huge amount of effort globally working on studying what to do about this, but the impacts are huge. I mean, any place that you have essentially an ACE2 receptor in your body, you have the potential for impact. So, all the issues related to the impacts on your brain, renal failure from clots in your kidneys, heart disease, impact to your blood vessels, your intestines, blah, 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 blah. That's a lot, Alex. And so I think the long COVID is going to have an impact on every healthcare system and every community and every family that's unfortunately has a person with it in their family. It's going to be a big deal. Orphaned kids. This came out just maybe a week or so after we last spoke. Here in the US, there's 1.5 million kids that have lost their caregiver. Wow. Excuse me, that's globally. It's 1.5, and that's from the World Health Organization. Here in the United States, it's about 400,000 kids who have lost their caregiver. So whether that was a set of parents, a single parent, grandparents. So think about a large number of orphaned kids. That's going to impact society for a really long time. Fractured healthcare systems. Healthcare workers are fried, burned out. Many places are going to take a long time to recover. There's increases in suicides for physicians. It's tough.
Or they're simply just quitting.
Yes. And that's a big deal. And again, we just mentioned about the usual vaccines not being done. But also there's a ton of medical diagnostic procedures that weren't done, like, mammography for women or screening for cervical cancer or colonoscopies. And those things are now appearing, months later with people having diseases that could have probably been found earlier, or delaying surgeries or treatments for cancer. And so diagnostic procedures and treatments, that's going to have another long issue where there'll be health impacts way beyond COVID. Huge issues with mental health. We've talked about this many times, but that ain't going away.
That's only going to get bigger. I think
it's only going to get bigger. I mean, people's behavior, it's just been gut-wrenching, right? And then the disrupted economies and the supply chain. I mean, look at the supply chain. It's still a huge mess. It's probably going to be that way I've seen studies as much as another year before it fully works its way out.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. There's a lot of
Yeah,
impact here.
lots to look forward to.
Yeah. Oh,
I'm kind of being sarcastic, obviously, with that, but
yeah.
it's not. I wish we could find some good news, but I don't think the good news is going to happen for quite some time yet, because we've got to go through a lot of these things that you just mentioned. The 400,000 kids in the U.S. that are orphaned. That's got me thinking, like, oh my goodness, what happens to them now?
Right.
Because not only have they been devastated for the rest of their life, but you add on top the mental health and the impacts of losing their parents or grandparents or caregiver, whoever it was. You add that, going through life now, now there will be an impact on other care systems or other providers to help those 400,000 kids get through life. So now, one person died, but it has a huge ripple effect. It's like throwing a stone in a pond, right? The ripples just keep going out and the impacts keep going out.
Yeah, it's gut wrenching. And I think, and then you magnify that, you look at many places around the world that are suffering from the same thing. And it's not just isolated to a particular country, it's a global phenomenon. And I didn't even mention things like kids that have had, of course, disrupted learning. And that whole, I was talking with some friends over the weekend, and they were saying, like my high school son, in his senior year didn't learn a thing. And now and they're just moving everybody forward, right? They're just moving everybody forward, because you can't just sort of say, okay, let's just repeat that year. That doesn't really work. And so you've got kids that have had a huge gap in learning. And yet when they go to their next grade, they're going to be treated as if, they probably learned everything that they were supposed to. And that's, of course, not the case. And so, and especially for disadvantaged families, that's going to even be harder. So I think the tail of the pandemic is going to be way longer than we've imagined.
Oh, a big, long tail. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with Regina Phelps, and we will be right back. Welcome back. We are talking with Regina Phelps today. Regina, let's jump to what I know many people are looking forward to, the upcoming holidays. What should we be considering?
And this is going to be a loaded bag on many levels, right? So, the holidays are important. They're a time for families to connect. There's religious rituals. There's all of these things. And yet this year is not going to be simple. It could be much better than last year, but it's not going to be simple. And so what does that mean for all of us as we go forward? Well, here in the US, interestingly enough, there are Americans that are hiding their vaccine status. You might have remembered about a quarterback from the Green Bay Packers you might have heard about that lied about their vaccine status. Well, there was a very recent poll from the Harris poll said that 1 in 10 Americans are not willing to admit whether they're vaccinated or not. And a lot of people are actually just lying up front. And so the poll also found that if people were vaccinated, they were less willing, no surprise, to spend time with an unvaccinated relative. And so here in the United States, we've got Thanksgiving happening in a couple of weeks. This is the time to have these conversations. And we, of course, have all the other holidays from many different religions for the next 60 plus days. So I call this the conversation that everybody needs to really have. And I know that in some families, this is like, igniting a bomb because there are very divided groups. Really people that are anti-vaccine, other people that are very pro-vaccine. And then there's the people in the middle that just would like to get together and they don't want to fight. But this is a big deal, especially if you have vulnerable individuals in your population. So older folks, immune suppressed people who can't get vaccinated. So again, infants all the way to the age of 5. So this is a conversation you have to have. It's about people's safety. So really what I'm recommending that your callers, that your listeners really do is that they start calling all of their family members, especially those that are unvaccinated that they know about, but really everybody, checking in, are you vaccinated? Now that may be a conversation where you point blank ask them that might be too much. So there's other ways that we can get there, but let me just talk about, you need to know whether they're vaccinated. And frankly, it would be really good to know if they were boosted as well, because that just tells you kind of what the topography looks like. And maybe the thing that you can ask that would be less threatening or starting the conversation might be something like, asking somebody, Alex, what's your advice about how we can make sure that everybody is safe and comfortable when we get together? So it's not saying, are you vaccinated? But you're sort of opening the conversation. Yeah. And of course, then vaccines would be a part of that. But also, we need to be talking about things such as ventilation. Ventilation is really important because this is an aerosol spread illness. If we're dining together, it's cold in Canada, people probably don't have windows open. How are you making sure that it's safer? Could you put a HEPA filter in the dining room? Could you have a window open? I mean, what can you do to encourage the movement of air? But ultimately, you're going to have to ask the question about vaccine. And then you have to make a decision about how comfortable you are. Now, other things that you could do, especially if you have a lot of vulnerable individuals in a household, is really consider whether you would have mandatory testing before the dinner. And this should be a home-based test, an antigen test that takes about 15 minutes. Those are, again, many times hard to find. They're increasing the supply substantially in the US, but it's going to be maybe tough to find. So if you're anywhere where there are antigen tests available in a drugstore, it would probably be a really smart idea that you just throw a couple in your cart for the holidays, especially before a party. And what I would say to you is that you could get a PCR test, but again, that usually takes 1 day, 2 days, 3 days to get the results. And remember, it is a point in time. Your status could have changed. And if you were out and about, you could have been exposed. So the idea is you might want to get a PCR test 3 days before you go to the dinner. Take an antigen test and see what your status is. And then if you're positive, stay home because you have the chance of infecting others. But the conversation about vaccines is really important. If you don't know somebody's status, if they're not vaccinated, then you have to have another conversation, which is, are you going to have people in the dinner that aren't vaccinated? And then what that means in a family.
Or tell people, stay away, you can't come.
Right. And that's, and I understand that that's probably a super difficult conversation, but it's one that, frankly, that we need to really talk about. There's a really helpful tool, and I did send you my slides from this month, and I also sent you a particular handout that the Surgeon General here in the United States prepared, which is actually really good. It's actually a document that really gives you a toolkit for how to address misinformation. Because as you know, there's a zillion crazy ideas about COVID, anywhere from, or the vaccine, anything from having a chip in your, in your body to being sterile or impotent. I mean, there's just a zillion things. And so this is a really great resource. And I would encourage your listeners to download it and review it, especially if you're going to go to public events or dinners, because it's going to give you some information that you can, again, have a conversation with people about. And I understand, oh my God, do I understand, that there are many people that you may never move off the dime, but you need to have something to be able to have a conversation about, and this might help you. And so the document's really good. It talks about, gives you tons of examples. And this is just one of them where there are different scenarios. So the one on the top left says, imagine your friend is worried about potential side effects from a flu shot. You might tell her these types of things. And then it also says to avoid certain other things. So it's giving you some tools. It's the idea of somebody maybe having a serious illness and they're concerned about being vaccinated. A neighbor starts talking about conspiracy theories. What do you say or do? An old friend is talking about information and, ideas about some sort of diet that might help them. It gives you, again, suggestions and thoughts, which is what we all need to try and work through these really awkward moments, right? And the last thing I would say,
that link in one of your slides there, I'll copy that link into the video and Voice America audio description so that people can get it that way.
That's great, because I think it's really important that we have tools. There's another one here that I'll just say as we sort of sum this up, is that there's another, my last slide has some additional tips for, again, how to talk to people, but also some of the more deeper dives into the most common misconceptions or falsehoods about the vaccine. Anything from pregnancy to, you know, how fast the vaccine was developed, to long-term effects, you know, can it change your DNA? These are some of the very common myths. And it's really helpful to have really good scientific information that you can be armed with, if you will. And again, I understand that many times we're not going to change somebody's opinion, but I think there's a feeling of frustration that we don't have the right responses. And I think, again, the holidays, there's a lot of time you might be spending with family members, and this gives you maybe a little bit more information to do that safely, but also armed with the kind of information that's going to be more helpful.
Yeah, this holiday I get to see family for the first time in almost 2 years. We're
Wow.
all fully vaccinated, so
Okay.
looking forward to that. But it's interesting. I just wanted to mention something I heard on the radio. They were talking about what's coming up for the holidays, because if you're unvaccinated, you have to get your needle about your first one, at least about now,
Right.
for the waiting period, you know, to get your second shot to be fully vaccinated by Christmas, you know, December 25th. So you have to have your needle just about now in the next day or so.
Exactly right. I mean, because essentially you get one shot, and then depending on what you've taken, it's 3 or 4 weeks later. So yeah, we're in that there's probably about a week left for most people to be fully vaccinated. And that means that you're still, you know, you're fully vaccinated at 14 days, but it's really you're fully vaccinated 14 days after your last shot. So technically that's already come and gone.
Yeah. Well,
right?
they were interviewing a gentleman, and they were asking him, what are you doing for the holidays, you know, especially with COVID? And he said, well, we've already had to tell one of our nephews he's not allowed to come and visit because some elderly people will be there. Everyone that will be there will be fully vaccinated. A couple of them will be elderly, you know, very susceptible to COVID and other things. So they said they had to turn around and tell one of their nephews, you can't come already. And they said, that's just the way it is. We're not putting other people's lives in danger.
Right.
We have 1 minute left.
Yes. And what I would say to all of your listeners is that this is the time to have the conversation about vaccines, what you're going to do at the holidays, so that everybody is prepared and there's not a gigantic blow up on the day of your holiday or your big dinner. So do it now.
Yeah. It's not going to be a pleasant conversation, but you've got to have it. You know?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Lives could be at stake here. So you've got to be, you know, you got to have the conversation. Regina, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Alex, a pleasure as always. And, you know, next month we'll talk about something, I don't know, COVID.
Yeah, well, probably. Yeah, it might be around a little bit more. But it'll be closer to holiday. It'll be our last show of the year.
Yes.
Next year. And then we can kind of have a bit of a break, I hope.
Me too. Me too.
Maybe start the new year without saying we have a spike.
That'd be great. I've got my fingers crossed.
Me too. Thanks, Regina. I really appreciate it.
You're
and
welcome.
Everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.